So, the article that we read was exploring the tension and conflicts that arise when teachers and students, in this case in South Africa, are expected to use English as the medium of instruction, even though they share a common home language. So, Margie Probin's research was published in the International Journal of Bilingual Education Bilingualism, and it was really focusing on how teachers navigate the gap between policy expectations and the realities of their classrooms. So, we're going to look at the complex dynamics of code switching, which is the practice of alternating between two or more languages, um, and just shedding more light on the challenges faced by educators as they try to balance policy requirements with the needs and linguistic practices of their students. So, South Africa has a very complex political and linguistic history with 11 official languages. And I think it's important for the historical context to understand the current language policies and classroom practices. So, the official language policies aim is to promote multilingualism, but the reality in many classrooms is really different. So, as I said, there's often a gap between the policy and what actually happens in the schools. So teachers frequently use both the official language of instruction and the students' home languages. And the code switching is serving an important function. It's facilitating comprehension and creating a more inclusive environment. However, it also creates dilemmas for teachers around balancing content teaching and language development. So these tensions have important implications, I think, for social justice, mental health, and education equity in South Africa, and we'll talk about by extension here in the United States. This is taken from the article, The Teacher Using Code Switching to Help Students Understand Scientific Concepts. So the teacher starts by asking a question in the student's home language of COSA and then guides them to English, to the English term pull, and finally the more scientific term attract. So this is demonstrating how moving between languages can build comprehension and make connection for students, and how the teacher is skillfully using the student's home language to establish the concept, then bridging to English and scientific terminology. So, this approach is helping students grasp the meaning and the appropriate vocabulary for the scientific idea of magnetism, right? So, this example is highlighting the value of code switching as an instructional technique to support student learning. So, as I mentioned, there are 11 official languages recognized in its constitution, in the South African Constitution. And while all the languages have official status, like English definitely dominates in politics and business and is seen as the language of opportunity. So, one teacher bluntly put it in the article that English puts bread on the table. And that's clearly highlighting the practical importance of English proficiency. But I think it's important to look at that complex linguistic landscape because the majority of the population are speaking African languages, but English is maintaining a dominant position. So that colonial period in South Africa was marked by an Anglicization, if I could say that, policy which denied Afrikaners the right to learn in their home language. So during the apartheid era, the nationalistic government implemented Bantu education, which enforced mother tongue instruction, which later sparked the 1976 Soweto uprising, um, when they tried to impose Afrikaans, which is another language that has a long history. So the post-apartheid democratic constitution recognized 11 official languages, but English has gained even more power and status in the global economy. So uh, the history this whole history has really tainted the concept of mother tongue instruction for African learners, and it's associated with apartheid education policies, while English is seen as the language of economic opportunity. So the 1997 Language in Education policy aimed to promote additive bilingualism by encouraging the use of home languages as the medium of instruction. And the policy was based on research showing that using a child's home language supports better conceptual development. However, the reality in many classrooms is quite different. Most schools choose English as the medium from grade 4 or earlier, despite limited English exposure outside the classroom. And this has led to a lack of resources and home support for literacy development in the home language. Um, Teachers and learners often share a common home language, so the code switching becomes a necessary classroom strategy. And as was noted earlier, there can be significant gaps between intention of education policy and actual implementation in the classroom. So, the central dilemma teachers face in bilingual classrooms, balancing that need for students to understand the academic content with the need to develop their English proficiency. And this, I think, was captured in the quote from the teacher who describes having to weigh the two and find a way for students to understand what you're actually teaching them, like the content, while also being able to express themselves. So, I think there's three key elements associated with the dilemma: content teaching, language development, and cultural identity. And teachers have to navigate these competing priorities. So, metaphors used were dragging, pulling, hooking students between languages, and they convey that sense of struggle and tension that teachers experience in trying to resolve the dilemma. So, the overall message is that teachers in bilingual classrooms face a complex challenge and trying to support both academic learning and language acquisition while also preserving the students' cultural identities. This can take an emotional toll, both on teachers and students in the classrooms. And the two quotes from teachers describing the challenges they face, where students feel inferior and unable to express themselves due to the use of English, and teachers feel helpless to support students who are struggling. And that language situation creates significant stress and tension in the classroom, contributing to high failure rates and feelings of alienation among the students. And I think for people working in education here, it's important to be aware of emotional impact and find ways to support yourself if you're working as a teacher or a counselor in a bilingual context. And it's draining. So code switching, again, is that practice of moving between languages, and it's often seen as an illegitimate teaching strategy, even though it can be effective. So many teachers feel guilty about using code switching, viewing it as something they shouldn't do. They may express the sentiment directly, saying things like, it's a bad thing to do. From the article, this perception that code switching is wrong has serious implications. Teachers feel ashamed to use this natural communicative strategy, so it remains hidden rather than being used systematically. Um, when observed, teachers may even change their language practices, avoiding code switching entirely, which poses challenges for classroom research, as observed behavior may not reflect normal practice. And Probin's research found that 2 out of 6 teachers had completely changed their language use during videotaped lessons, and they thought code switching was not allowed. So the first section outlines the cognitive support functions of code switching, such as teaching new terms in the home language, rephrasing in the home language when learners don't understand, emphasizing important points, and supporting exploratory talk in group work. The second is covering the affective support functions, including using code switching for classroom management and discipline, gaining and holding attention, reducing alienation of the subject matter, making jokes, building rapport. And the final point highlights how these code switching patterns are remarkably similar to those reported in post colonial contexts in Asia and Africa, suggesting common responses to shared linguistic challenges. So, key takeaway is that code switching serves important cognitive and affective functions in the multilingual classroom, and these patterns are not unique to this context that we were reading about. So here we're looking at the tension between language and cultural identity in the classroom. There's two perspectives, right? A learner who prefers to learn through their home language and a teacher who recognizes the practical need for English despite concerns about losing local languages and cultures. So I think the key point is that the choice of language in education is not just a practical matter. Um, it's tied to issues of identity, loyalty, and the preservation of cultural traditions. And I would like to emphasize the complex and nuanced nature of this issue. I mean, there are valid arguments and perspectives on both sides that need to be carefully considered. I would encourage you to reflect on your own experiences and contexts and consider how language policies in education impact cultural identity and community for yourselves. So repetition is a key strategy to reinforce key terms and concepts multiple times for better understanding. Speaking at a slower pace and using voice tone effectively can support learners' comprehension. Using visual aids like gestures, demonstrations, and chalkboard consolidation provides additional support. Making connections to learners' own experiences and using analogies can help them relate the content to their context. And these are all things that experienced teachers do. They employ a range of these sophisticated pedagogical strategies alongside code switching to effectively support learning in challenging linguistic environments. So, the implications of classroom code switching in South Africa go beyond, again, linguistic interest. They are tied to issues of social justice, education equity. We need to recognize the reality that there's a gap between language policy and actual classroom practice. We need to provide teacher training on how to effectively teach in bilingual situations. Schools should develop language policies that take the contextual realities into account rather than just instituting a one size fits all approach. And ultimately, in this article, which again by extension applies to other contexts, we need to break a poverty trap in the case of South Africa, by enabling townships and rural learners to gain access to both knowledge and linguistic resources, just like their urban middle class peers. So the article was suggesting that if these issues aren't addressed, that language and education is going to continue to contribute to a widening gap between the haves and the have-nots, which goes against the goals of equity access and readdress. So bringing it to the US, of course, we have our own very rich linguistic tapestry with over 350 languages spoken in homes across the country. Um, we have some that are more dominant, certainly, than others, but, or I should say, more prominent. But we really can mirror that multilingual reality of South Africa. And I think, despite the fact that we have so many different languages being spoken in the United States, education office that often emphasizes that English immersion, which can create barriers for millions of English language learners. And while not formally termed code switching, that dynamic use of multiple languages or translanguaging occurs naturally, but is often unofficially discouraged, similar to the perceptions in South Africa. So, failing to support students' full linguistic repertoires can exacerbate educational disparities, hindering access to knowledge and cultural validation for non-English dominant students. So I think understanding these parallels can inform more inclusive and effective pedagogical approaches globally, right? Really fostering environments where linguistic diversity is seen as a strength and not as a barrier. I think that counselors need to continue, as we've been discussing, recognize how language barriers and pressure to conform linguistically can impede effective therapeutic communication and a client's ability to express complex emotions. Um, for individuals from diverse backgrounds, language it can be tied to feelings of self-worth and cultural identity. So, where possible, creating a safe space where all linguistic expressions are valued, countering any internalized shame from experiences like code switching um, is important. Uh, I think that linguistic discrimination, marginalization, or the imposition of dominant languages can contribute significantly to psychological distress, anxiety, and identity confusion. So we want to stay attuned to these potential sources of trauma. Where possible, adopting a translanguaging approach in therapy where clients can use their full linguistic repertoire can foster that deeper self-expression and build strong rapport as well as enhance the therapeutic process for multilingual individuals. So I think by understanding these dynamics, you can provide more culturally sensitive and effective support with clients. And that's what I want to say.